is that people in various polls, the Gallup polls and also the Barna polls, it would appear that people who claim to be followers of Jesus or to have had a born-again experience hardly differ from the ambient culture in terms of the metrics of morality and own character and integrity. Hardly different. And that's kind of a shocking thing. There ought to be a dramatic difference between those who are followers of Jesus and those who are followers of this world. The degree to which we've been acculturated then and become children of our culture, I think, is a great deal more than we'd like to admit. And so we do well to back off. And really, I think what we have to do as an antidote to our culture, and this is just parenthetical, but we need a little privacy and a little stillness. We need a little reflection in the scriptures. We need to back off and gain perspective, without which you will really be pulled along by the nose of the culture. The culture's going to keep leading you along, and you'll just be seduced by it. And so instead of being one who's conformed to the world, Paul says that we are in fact to be transformed by the renewing of the mind. And that transformation by the renewing of the mind leads to a different form of conformity, namely the conformity to the image of Christ. So we're called to be conformed to His image, not conformed to the world. But the only way that'll happen is by the constant renewal of the mind, and the only way that'll happen is by a series of choices that we need to make. These are choices, and they're one of the 7 deadly sins that we often hear it called sloth. The monastics actually use the word acedia. And acedia, A-C-C-E-D-I-A, is a word that can mean not just laziness in terms of physical laziness, but there's a deeper form of laziness. It's a spiritual sloth. And this laziness can be really something where we choose not to do what we probably know we should do when we need to do it. And that is to say, we kind of get away from certain disciplines and get sloppy and lazy and self-indulgent, rather than really choosing to do the things that we know will draw us closer to Christ and also to cause us to be people who are distinguishably different from the ambient world. So we are called to have a unique message, and we're also called to have a life that conforms to that message in this world, rather than being people who are led around by the culture. So that you'll prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. So that's your calling, character, and your culture. Then he goes into your calling. The third C. Among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life. Now that's a good word, because that really is a good calling for us to have. What we're called to do is to appear as lights in the world. In other words, to provide an alternative. Now when you think about the darkness and how even the smallest light can permeate and provide light, guidance in the dark. If you were, for example, spelunking and you found yourself, the light went out, your flashlight goes out and you're completely in the dark, even the smallest pinprick of light would be enough for you to see, and you'd be able to at least know where that's coming from and perhaps where to go. But the point here is that the light overcomes the darkness. And thus we do not want to be people who are just seduced in such a way that there is no light, but rather we're called to be an alternate, a kind of a counterculture, an alternative society that gives us, that is pervaded by a very real light and vitality. And so he uses this expression, holding fast the word of life. So as a light of the world, you're holding fast this word that never is irrelevant, this word that always has power, a word of God that has the power to transform lives. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God, says Paul, and it is this power that brings about true transformation. It's the greatest power in the world. The transformation of a person from an unregenerate to a regenerate state is really in many ways greater than any other power you can imagine. It's tantamount to the resurrection from the dead. And so there is this, and we ourselves, we can share this message, but only the Spirit of God can bring about that. But there's a very real power in the word of life. So there's your character, your culture, and your calling within that culture. And finally, the fourth C comes from this expression, so that in the day of Christ I may have reason to glory, because I didn't run in vain nor toil in vain. What I'm thinking there is the word becoming of Christ. And so what we have here is living in light of the day of Christ. In other words, that's the eternal perspective. The day of Christ ought to be on our calendar. It ought to be a regular part of how we think, that that day can come at any time. When we stand before Him, as we will inevitably do, we do well to ask ourselves the question now, what will it take for us to live a satisfied life, a life that we can live in such a way that our desire would be, our aspiration, to hear the words of the King who says to us, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And thus, that's why Paul was able to go on in spite of adversities and afflictions and sorrows and persecutions, all kinds of setbacks, because he understood that when I'm weak, then I am strong. When Christ is strong in me, what we discover is that the sufferings of this present time, Paul recognized, aren't worthy to be compared with the glory to be revealed to us. And so he always understood the now in the light of that day of Christ. And so this, I think, is a very powerful verse for us. It gives us a perspective that I think can be very valuable. Any comments or questions on that before we move on? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a two-part question.
Mr. President.
Would the Bereans be a New Testament counterpart to the men of Issachar? And number two, Barna was interviewed recently, and he said that in his 7 Tribes, his new book, he said like 66% of professing Christians are what he calls casual Christians. And he said the difference is that they sort of bring a thin veneer on their lifestyle instead of letting their Christian commitment determine their lifestyle.
Yeah. So Barna is using this image of a casual Christian as opposed to, what's his other term, committed? What was the percentage he said was casual Christians? 66%. That's not surprising. I would have thought it would be higher. To be honest with you, I think that's generous. But I think that's the issue. Yeah, he's asking the question about Issachar relative to the Bereans, and but there may be something to be said for that. He says those in Berea were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica because they received the Word of God. They really searched the Scriptures daily to see whether these things were true. And so they actually were more receptive and responsive to the Word of God. So there's a very real, that's why a lot of Sunday school classes are called Bereans. Comes from that verse in Acts 17. So as I see it then, this is a theme of how do I respond to the Word of God? You see, they studied it, searched it to see if it was so, and then they wanted to see how it looked like in life. And so the casual Christian, as Barna is using that term, is one who really marginalizes it and puts it on the sidelines in a certain sense. Now, C.S. Lewis was absolutely right in an essay that was published in the book God in the Dock. He said that Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. You see, what they've done is they've made it moderately important. It's only a component, not the center. And that's really what comes down to it, as I see it, is the compartmentalized life versus the centralized life is another way of describing this difference. The one for whom Christ is the hub and from whom all things, all the spokes radiate, where everything is integrated back to Him, whatever I'm doing, then that is a life that's integrated and consistent and centralized around Him. That's a committed life. The life that we would say is compartmentalized is such that Christ is a little part of our life over here. There are other parts over there, and rarely are they really connected together. It's just a component. So we might suppose that We'll put that at the forefront in certain times, Sunday morning perhaps, or a Bible study or whatever it might be. And that, in my opinion, is to have a disintegrated life. It's not connected. It's not integrated. The